welcome to Nature Nova Scotia Nature Talks. My name is Unity Cooper. I am the coordinator assistant with Nature Nova Scotia, and we also have our coordinator here with us tonight, Becky Parker. We are honored tonight to be joined by James, who is a geographer who teach at Dalhousie University in Earth and Environmental Sciences, as well as the Marine Affairs program. His area of interest is in sea level rise and coastal impacts. He is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and he works extensively in GI science and GIS. James is going to be talking about climate change and the good news in respect to the climate crisis, which I'm sure is an interesting topic right now. So I won't waste too much of our time tonight. I know folks are probably really interested in getting right into our presentation. If you are new joining us tonight, I will make sure there's some information about Nature Nova Scotia and how you can get involved more with Nature Talks in the future. Without much further ado, let me introduce James. So, James, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do at Dalhousie, and we can go right into your presentation.
A dear friend of mine, Brian Scarry, who's a photographer for National Geographic, and Brian does some amazing ocean photography and underwater photography. A neat person to know. I do work, I manage the GIS Center at Dalhousie University, which means I do a lot of computer mapping and analysis of various things that are going on in the world related to, could be health, it could be oceans, it could be development of urban areas. It changes from day to day. I am, yes, as Unity said, I'm a geographer and I love being a geographer. It's probably the coolest thing in the world. And today it's probably more important than ever. And my teaching has been and still is the primary thing that I do and the thing I love the most. And I have been teaching at Dal for over 30 years, and I've been teaching completely for 37 years. I hate to say that because it tells how old I am. So that's just a wee little bit about me. The thing I tell my class, by the way, is I am a pessimist for the short term, meaning the next few years, but I am an extreme optimist for the future. So, and that's what I want to kind of talk about. And thank you, by the way, Unity and Becky, for having me here. It's a great pleasure. And hi, everybody. And I hope I have enough time. Well, I'm going to make enough time for us to have a lot of questions and answers. So without further ado, I'm going to try, and hopefully this works. I'm going to try and share my screen. And is that working? It should be. Yes, okay. So here we go. There's definitely two ways to look at the world and what's going on. One is what we think should be happening, and the other is reality. And reality is always messy. So I'm going to take you down a messy side and maybe a better, more side in terms of our expectations and where we're going. Oops, it should be moving, but there we go. I saw this article by David Wallace Wells in the New York Times, and the headline, he didn't actually like the headline, but it was put out there, "Time to Panic." And when I saw that headline, I thought, okay, let's see what he thinks. And I went out and bought his book and read it. And it wasn't that bad in the book. But immediately I thought about, what if my students were looking at this headline? What would they think? Time to panic. And that was not what I want people to do. It's not what I hope for them to do. Part of the thing about being a geographer and a geography educator is I get to hang out with other people that teach geography. And a lot of the discussions we're having at the present time deal with talking about these things in an honest way, dealing with the big issues of the day and finding out what's the best way to teach it so that we don't have people hitting the panic button. I often talk about the planet Earth, but I always like to say it's planet water. I'm a blue person. I'm an ocean person. 71% of the Earth is water. If you were to take climate change and start to look at what we have to deal with, water's a big, big, big issue. But I also look at the land and say, okay, who owns most of the land and where is it? Those are the countries that we have to deal with first and foremost in terms of climate change, the big ones, Russia, Canada, China, United States, Brazil, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a blue planet. And it's a blue marble, as you might see, hanging out in space. And that's one of the things we have to start to think about. Just to hit that nail on the head, there's all the water of the planet, all the water, all the ice, everything into one little ball on the whole sphere. And there's all the air of the Earth into one ball. Not a lot when you consider the whole size of the Earth. So the amount of water and air is very, very small. And so when we're dealing with climate change, we have to remember that we're dealing with a very small amount of the Earth. Now let's get some pessimism out of the way. Yes, the world is warming up. Over the last number of years, our mean temperature, the average temperature we're getting to, is hitting about 1.1 degrees Celsius. Prior to this time, prior to the 2000, our mean temperature was about 0.4, 0.5 degrees Celsius above the norm. Some of the things that have happened here, like 2016, the top line, that just blew our minds. Those climate scientists were like, what the heck just happened? This current year, you can see in those little dots, we're moving towards being in the top 6 of warmest years ever. There is no disputing, based upon observations, that we are warming up, and that warming up causes a lot of things. So we can push that warming up issue aside. I like to think about climate change in very, very different ways. And Unity will probably back me up on this in the way that I teach in my class. I don't teach from the normal perspective of things. So I like to use different stuff, like Marshall McLuhan's view. We look at the present through a rearview mirror, we march backwards into the future. As we're moving forward, we're looking at the past. And in climate change, this is something we do a lot in terms of our modeling, but we're also comparing how we're doing today to the past. The example I use is one McLuhan used. We still use the term horsepower when we talk about cars and automobiles and other things like tractors and trucks and whatnot. But we don't have horses. We don't have horses running them anymore, but we still use that term. So we move forward while having a sense of the past. And in terms of the past in climate, we've known about the issue for a long time. This article from 1912 talks about what would happen if we continue to burn coal. So it's not like this is a new thing. It's something that has been out there for a long, long time. I also put a link to a YouTube video there, which was done in 1958 by Bell Labs, the people who make the telephone, Bell Labs, which actually explained in 1958 what would happen if we produced more CO2, and that greenhouse gases would build and the temperature would go up. This is not a new issue. But there's some interesting parts about not being a new issue. One or two here I like is we use the phrase carbon footprint. Where did that come from? Carbon footprint is a term that came from the fossil fuel industry. So the people that we're trying to deal with in terms of getting rid of fossil fuels are the same people that gave us the notion of carbon footprint, which was designed, by the way, to put the blame on the individual rather than on the system. And that is something to keep in mind. The other one I put in here is the Global Climate Coalition. You have to almost laugh at the phrases that people use to develop organizations. The Global Climate Coalition sounds like a group that would be, dealing with climate change and fighting the good fight. But what they did in 1997 is they spent $13 million to put advertisements out there to convince the President of the United States to not sign on to Kyoto. And it worked. The President of the United States did not sign on to the Kyoto Agreement. And in fact, later on, he credited the Global Climate Coalition in terms of not doing that. So the advertisement worked. Another group of the Informed Citizens for Climate put something out and said, there's no global warming. The sky's not falling. Why are we thinking about this as a terrible thing? So advertisement and language becomes an important thing. And you'll hear that later as I talk more about that. And my favorite, in the New York Times in 84 and 93, took out full page advertisements in the New York Times talking about, the lies we tell our kids about climate change and global warming, as they called it then, global warming. And then that, oh no, there's not an apocalypse coming. This is all false science. So we were told, or people were told by these organizations, that we're wrong. And this continued, and millions of dollars were spread to try to get this out there as a message. Luckily, there are groups that come back and fight against that. Now, this is more recent, but this is Oxfam, and Oxfam has put out these briefings on inequality. And the primary thing here is the richest produce the most pollution, the richest countries produce the most pollutions, and the people who make the top incomes produce the most pollution. And one of the things that really was disturbing when I read this was that 68 families control 50% of the wealth of the planet. 68 families. I could not fathom that when I read that, but this is what's going on. Now, from the climate science standpoint, colleagues have put out things about, well, if this is the truth, why haven't we changed the perspective of people? And the primary thing in this particular paper was that we need to change the system in order to change what's happening as a result of climate change. And that doing all these little things on the side, while important, isn't having an impact. It's not moving us forward. Why isn't it moving us forward? Well, first of all, we can't go back. We can't go back to the industrial period where we had, mass industrialization, huge factories, and children sadly working in those. Although one of the concerns I have is that we have children working in industries related to climate change now, such as cobalt mining in the Congo. Cobalt, of course, being used for our phones that we carry around, or people making the clothes that we go and get, $5 t-shirts. So we still have that system of industrialization, that there's inequity and there's an immorality to it. But all of this is based upon the notion that we have to move, according to this model, towards a high mass consumption society. Not just a consumption, but high mass consumption. So consumption is the key here. And Rostow developed this model, and actually he was an economic advisor to Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president of the United States, and said, this is where we have to go as a society, high mass consumption. More consumption, more fossil fuels, more greenhouse gases, more temperature increase. So the models we developed have done this. But here's one that concerned me most when I thought about the development of that high mass consumption. This is a recent thing. The Ultimate Trust Barometer has been done for a number of years. And what they do is they look at how much trust we have in particular groups. And they survey 33,000 people. So it's not like a little telephone survey. This is a massive survey that's been going on year after year. And if you notice there in the black square, business is considered to be more competent and more ethical than the NGOs, than the media and government. So people now have shifted their views to the point where business is considered more competent and more ethical than any other group and any other organizations in our society. I don't have anything against business, by the way. I have very good friends that would look at this and they're in business. They'd say they're ethical, not necessarily competent, but they're very, very ethical about their work. But this really is a shift in how we view society and how we view what we're doing and why. So again, I think it turns to the mass consumption model of Rostow. So what's happening? Well, there's a little irony here because we're taping this using social media. So there's some irony involved in this. But one of my favorite books is one by Neil Postman called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And I think what's happened is we've moved from mass consumption of things to add in mass consumption of time and mass consumption of ourselves and our energy, to the point where being involved in things, doing things, thinking about things, going for a walk, working together in terms of action and being proactive towards things like climate change. We're now spending our time online. And this slide, by the way, is what's happening every 60 seconds. This isn't daily. This is every 60 seconds this happens. So every 60 seconds, Walmart has 17,000 transactions online. Excuse me, sorry. Might make you think, well, I give up. This is crazy. I'm not going to go on. I get, like who can deal with this sort of thing? There's a lot of noise out there. I was trying to think of how do I put in all the headlines that I have, and I've collected hundreds of them and hundreds of studies to use for class. But how do I put in those? Well, I decided not to include them because you could put in words of panic and despair into every headline you wanted from every news organization around the world. And you would have all these things saying the world is going to end in essence. So we're all going to die. There's a catastrophe and apocalypse. I could also put in a polar bear, because if you do a climate change talk, by the way, you're always supposed to put a polar bear in there. And if you don't put a polar bear, then it's not a climate change talk, because polar bears, we love, the Coca-Cola commercials of the polar bears sliding down and drinking Coca-Cola. It's a thing we have to do. So I'm not doing that. I'm not putting in the polar bear and I'm not putting the headlines. But I will give you some headlines. There's a concern amongst many, many people especially those in the younger age groups, about reproduction and climate change. There's a concern about having children. That, notice the title, apocalypse, that if there's an apocalypse coming, why should we have children? Now, I look at this and I think, well, I remember I was married in 1985, and I remember going on peace marches in the early 80s and later 80s, and we thought we were all going to die because nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs were going to fall on our head at any given moment. There are still nuclear weapons out there, but what we thought was going to happen didn't happen. So the notion of not having children didn't play out. We have anxiety amongst our youth, massive amounts of anxiety related to climate. And the mental health issues that are related to this, the cost of it, it's just outrageous. Imagine half of child psychiatrists are talking to people about environmental anxiety. So much so that the people in the UK in this particular case, 57, 58% of them put a letter forward to the government saying, you got to do something about this. We cannot deal with this issue. The anxiety is too great. Where's that anxiety coming from? I have nothing against any organization doing protests. I have a little bit of a problem with a group being called the Extinction Rebellion. The extinction word kind of bothers me, but protests, I'm okay with that. I've done it. But imagine if you're telling everybody who's young that there's an extinction coming, that this is not going to work, and that we only have 10 years left to deal with this issue. You're going to raise that fear and anxiety to a point where it's going to have a negative impact on mental health. And then I have to deal with that somehow in my classroom. I have to deal with that. And I have to deal with conversations with people around me. So this is a reality check of what we're doing. Then you see things like this, George Monbiot, the earth is in a death spiral. I mean, that's a pretty phenomenal thing to say to the public, and where youth will be reading it as well. Then I look at Vietnam, and I know Vietnam well. I've worked there. I've done climate change research and work there, and I provided solutions to their government, and these have been put in place. And so, for example, Ho Chi Minh City is looking at how to develop, how to cope, how to adjust, how to adapt. That we know what we have to do. At the same time, the children fear climate change. So there's a disconnect between the action and the attitude, between what's happening and the fear. There's a disconnect there. And my worry here is, what are we doing to our children? We're raising this notion of fear to the point where it's bothering them, it's killing them in a sense, in mental health terms. And that really disturbs me as a client science person. And it makes me sometimes panic about what's going on in the sense of what's happening to our kids. If I didn't have hope, if I was sort of like buying into all that stuff, I'd be out in a cottage, which I'm probably getting, on the Shetland Islands in a little sailboat and enjoying my life in the middle of nowhere. If I didn't have hope, that's what I would be doing right now. I wouldn't be doing the things I'm doing. But I have hope, and I have desire, and I have some action inside me that I want to contribute. So while I take a drink of water here, because I have a water in my I'm doing a disposable plastic mug, thing like that. I got to put a little advertisement for my former student. You got to have a laugh too in climate science and climate change. If you're always serious and don't look at the funny, then life becomes not enjoyable. So here's the crux of the hope. Marie Curie won 2 Nobel Prizes. And the quote that I love is this: nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less. And this was written over 100 years ago, but it speaks to today. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less. And that's the key with the children, as an example, in that particular case I was thinking about. We need to change perspective. We need to see things differently. If you want to find bad news, if you want to find hate or anger or anything else, easy to do. Just check the news any day. Check any website, Facebook, whatever you want. But we need to change perspectives. And here's a little way that I like to change perspectives, which is completely outside the box. Did you know that in 1810, the tin can was invented? But the patent for the tin can opener was in 1870. The fax machine was invented by Alexander Bain in 1843, but the telephone was invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. What we think of the world and how we see things in terms of their continuity, in terms of how they connect from A to B to C to D, is not always that way. And we can use this when we start looking at how we will deal with climate. Things change. They change for the good. So if you're looking at a place, Amsterdam, 1970, it looks horrible. I mean, the streets are filled with cars. It looks, yes, it's black and white. It looks dirty, but you can just imagine what it would be like. And in 2010, cars are pretty much gone. The trams are there. People along the sidewalks having fun, mixing and mingling, getting to know each other. Who knows? People are meeting their future spouse. Whatever happens, but it's more connected to the community, whereas the previous one was connected to the car. This is kind of weird. So we have a perspective of subway maps, and all the world is based upon a common map, which was developed in the UK. So we have these cartograms that show how to get around London. This one, to change perspectives, is in Welsh. So it's not in English, so you have to get used to the Welsh aspect of it. But if you were to look at the city as the subway and look at how it actually is shaped based upon topography and direction and movement, it's completely different. So how we see things and how we're shown things, that's the way we have to change our perspective to understand how things are slightly different than what we expect. That brings me to the notion of language. The Metcalf Foundation did a survey of environmental organizations, environmental leaders, and they said, okay, what do you think of the words that we should use to deal with climate change? So the words they came up with, the big one there is survival, sustainability, justice, planet, future, so on and so forth. When I saw this, I thought, okay, I get it, but I have a problem with the notion of survival. Our species, in some way, shape, or form, will survive. Other species, not all of them necessarily, but other species will survive. Even when we had the planet blow up from an asteroid, life came back. We didn't exist until after that fact. So survival is a bit of a heavy term to use in any sort of communication amongst environmental organizations. But maybe what we have to look at is, the future. Maybe that's the word we should focus on, the future, and that can encompass more. So the language we use determines how we view climate change. We can view it negatively or positively. Positive gives us room for action. Negative gives us room to freeze. This comes out in other studies. So this one in Nature that was discussed was, how can you change the discussion about climate change by changing your language? And the person in the study actually ended up talking to the president of Austria. And during the discussion with the president of Austria, they changed the way they discussed the issues, which then the president was saying, oh, now I get it. Yeah, that's fine. That makes sense. Changing the language and the way you discuss person to person changed the way the person wanted to act. Changing conversations. If you want to start a conversation with a person, an individual, one-on-one, there are ways to do it. This one is a tie. You can get a t-shirt, you can get all sorts of things like this, but it shows temperature change over 110 years. And clearly it goes from colder to warmer. But that's a way to start a conversation. It's not a way to dictate the graphs, the temperature changes, the mathematics of it. You don't get into the models and climate building models and so on and so forth. You get into things about, what do you think? How do you feel? What do we know? What can we do about it? It changes it from pessimistic and science, too much science, into optimistic and human-based. One of the best human-based examples I've seen, this was in COP26, was when the foreign minister of Tuvalu got into the water and did his few minutes talk to the conference from inside the water and said, this is what it will look like if we keep going. You could take it as a very pessimistic view, or you could take it as a sort of, this is the way to express it, not to express it in standing at a podium outside the water and talking about the science and the numbers and the economics of it, but just sitting there as a human, standing there as a human being in the water saying, this is how it affects me. This is how it affects my people. This is why it's important. It changes the perspective, it changes the language, it changes the way we view and do things. Are we, this is one, are we overreacting? Well, some people come out and put in books like this Bjorn Lomborg, who's put it out of Denmark, and he has a research institute there, and heavily criticized in the climate community because way too often he's naive, and he also cherry picks his data, which is a bad thing as well. But he's talking about the fact that climate change is going to ruin our economies and it won't help fix anything. So the person who did a book review, I love this, in the New York Times, was Joseph Stieglitz. You may not know, but Joseph Stieglitz is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. So he took him on and said, no, we don't have to destroy our economy. We don't have to destroy everything. We can fix this. And, he put forward an extremely good case for that. The reason why I also picked this out is because if you look at the quote, it's got a Nova Scotia connection. It's quite, I love that particular quote about, oh, wouldn't it be great to swim in Nova Scotia if the ocean warmed? No, not so sure. But hope is out there if you look for it, if you want to read about it, if you want to find out and inform yourself about what can actually be done. There is hope out there, a lot of hope, by people who are extremely good in the field, extremely bright, better than I am, and make their case in eloquent ways. There are people talking about changing the attitudes by changing how we talk to the public, shifting attitudes by shifting conversations, not by talking about the doom and gloom, but talking about the opportunities, talking about how we can work together as people, how we can change the way we do things for the better, not just for climate change, but for the better and whole. Now, I want to take a second here for you to read this from top to bottom and then bottom to top. Just take a moment to do that. I'm not advertising Patagonia, by the way. But this is how language and the way we discuss things and portray things and put them forward in the public domain, this is how we change our perspectives. It's easy to put something forward as a negative. It's also as easy to put forward things as a positive. And I like to look at this as, hey, I'd rather read this from the bottom up because it speaks to me and speaks to what I'm doing. But all too often in the media and in our discussions in public, we go from the top to bottom. And that's when we get in trouble. That's why all those kids in all those surveys are having anxiety issues, mental health issues. That's why people are feeling like there's no hope, because we're only reading top to bottom. And it's time to shift that perspective and read bottom to top. So what can we see in the actual science? Well, we're getting within reach. This doesn't look good. This looks like, oh my gosh, we're going to be at, 2.6, 2.9, 2.1, whatever is going to be the range, right? But this is better than it was. Pledges and targets used to be above 3 degrees. They used to be above 4 degrees. Current policies used to take us up to 5 degrees Celsius. We now have brought it down. We haven't fixed anything in the total sense of the word, but we've shifted gears. We've now started to see how to deal with it to bring it down. We can look at other things like emissions and see what's happening. Yes, looks like a lot of lines going up, that there's more emissions. True. But if you look at the trend of the whole line, not 1 year, you can see in the USA and the EU, there's somewhat of a flattening of the line. China seems to be hitting a bubble at the top. All the other nations, well, yes, that's like 180 nations. Yeah, they're going up because little bit by little bit by little bit. India and China are the two that we have to deal with. We have to find a way to deal with India as an example. Maybe in terms of climate equity, we have to go to India and say, look, we will give you everything we possibly can at zero cost so that you can deal with your climate change and deal with fossil fuel energy and the coal and everything else. We'll give it to you to help protect it. We have to start shifting that thought pattern, just like we have to start shifting it for vaccines, for example, and give our vaccines to most of the developing world where a small percentage have the vaccine. Looking at other things like what's happening in terms of other forms of energy, right? These are trends. These aren't perfect. They're not the best news that we need, but they're good news. You know, we're going up in geothermal, solar, wind, nuclear. Nuclear is an issue that people don't want to talk about. But maybe we have to have that discussion. I'm not pro-nuclear, but I'm not necessarily anti-nuclear. And I'll give you a reason why is, yes, Chernobyl, was terrible, but we have aircraft carriers and submarines out there in the ocean that have had nuclear power for 50 years, same nuclear reactors, and nothing's happened. So the question is, what can we do in a small scale that will work? Should we use it? Maybe not. But should we talk about all of these things? Yes, we need to talk about them in order to either discard them or include them. Biomass has huge issues. There are huge issues with biomass, but we include it in this sort of thing of, energy sources that are better to use rather than not. You'll hear a lot of people talk about natural gas as a solution. It's not a solution. It's another one of those fossil fuels we have to try to avoid. We need to go to different ways of producing energy. There's no doubt about that. So I mentioned trends, and where are we? Well, if we had have stayed as we were, the sort of business as usual, in fact, increasing year after year our consumption, we would have gone up to a really, really bad 5 degrees Celsius or more. We're nowhere near that. We're not even doing that. That's not even on the table. In fact, as I told, Unity will know, as I told the class, we use the scenarios of the worst case, not because we think they're going to come true, but because it's a way of measuring the accuracy of our models. So that's why we use the worst case scenario, because it measures that accuracy. Where are we going to go? We're actually now, those current policies and pledge promises, we're in that area where we're getting lower and lower. Yeah, it looks like we're going up, but we're actually going down if you go relative one to the other. So I'm optimistic when I see that. I know we have to do more. I am not disputing how much we have to do, and we have to do it quickly. But I'm given a lot of optimism that we've halted the move towards the really bad areas, the really bad temperature increases. And hopefully we'll be able to do more. And I'm certain that the next generations and two will be able to get us there faster. And here's where I start to get even more optimistic. Greenhouse gas emission reductions. These graphs, if you look at them, you can check out particular parts of the graph in terms of the type of energy that's used. But if you look at that, there's a black line in each one of them. That's the trend line for all the greenhouse gas emissions by all parts of greenhouse gas, things like coal, oil, natural gas. The trend line and all those are going down. The trend line in all these are going down. Like, that's a good thing. That's a positive message. But you don't see that in the news. Nobody comes up and says, hey, look at these graphs. They're great. Nobody does that on the news. You won't get anybody on CBC at the supper time news saying, hey, let's look at these graphs, because people don't want to. They have 3 minutes to do a section. Oh, by the way, you'll notice Canada's not on any of these graphs. That's a sad one. Yeah, this is one. Ocasio, talking about doing a World War II effort to deal with climate change, because we need something big and global, an effort. Okay, I can see this. But in World War II, in 1944, they had this event called Bretton Woods, where all the countries that were not part of the, Germany, Italy, Japan, but all the countries from the Western side, if you want to call it that, got together and developed a system for the economy, for rebuilding Europe, developing the World Bank, IMF, and so on and so forth, different rules and trade and so forth. They don't necessarily work perfectly today, but they were developed at that particular time. It was a World War II effort. So maybe we need a World War II effort to get this going. But What does that really involve? And the other thing is, you don't have many people alive today from World War II. So how do we actually understand what really went on? Well, I'd like to look at it as maybe that World War II notion is a tipping point, and that we're at that tipping point right now. So Malcolm Gladwell wrote an amazing book on the tipping point, on doing little things that can make big differences. I would highly recommend it. It's really, really cool. But then I also found this thing that I didn't know about, the tipping point, meaning tipping over, the climate change card game. Like I didn't realize there was such a thing. But then there's another book, The Tipping Point, The End is Near. That's written by an evangelical Christian who's saying that basically the world is going the direction it's supposed to go because that was what the Bible said. So however you look at the tipping point and how we're moving towards, and whether we're moving towards the right direction, depends upon your perspective. But I thought I'd just throw in that notion of the tipping point. And here's my tipping point. When they talked about the World War II effort. This is my grandmother's diary. She kept a diary from 1917 to 1987 every day. And on this particular one, she wrote in Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1939, war declared with Germany. And if you notice, you look a little down, you'll see the 11th of September, Colin, that's my dad, Colin back to school. Life continued. They went on. They were bombed during the Blitz. Dad told me about those events. My grandmother gave birth to a baby underneath the stairs because of a bombing. That's the only place she could go that was semi-safe to give birth. But they lived through this. So a World War II effort, we need to look back at people and how they did things and worked together in order to survive. Not suggesting the war is good or bad, but how they did it and why they did it and how they worked as communities and people. There are other people out there talking about climate change in a positive way. Catherine Hayhoe, who's a Canadian, who is actually at the University of Texas and is an evangelical Christian and makes no bones about it. But she does this series on YouTube called Global Weirding, and she talks about the positives that are out there. The fact that we don't have to be panicking, but that we can do things, and that communicating individual makes a difference. And talking about our common humanity. And I kind of admire that. She talks about things, excuse me, like new ideas that were coming up, like circular economies, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where how can we develop a new system of organizing our economies so that we aren't utilizing so many resources and producing so many greenhouse gases? We have things like the Sustainable Development Goals. Didn't have this when I was younger, but now we're looking at not only the environment and climate change, but all of the things that we're doing in our society of how can we deal with these things in real terms. What can we actually do to deal with these issues? This is, they're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. They want to complete or at least come to some sort of record by 2030. I'm excited by what's happening with those. But here's the hope. UNICEF does a survey, and in spite of everything I've shown you, young people are more optimistic than the older generations. So maybe it's my generation that's, putting forward this notion that everybody's depressed and anxious and fearful, but that the youth are actually more optimistic. That would be an amazing thing. So UNICEF did this wonderful study, and I really, really enjoyed reading it. Other people like Michael Mann. Michael Mann is, by the way, probably the most preeminent climate scientist in the world. And he did this talk about doomism, about feeling like things were doomed. But at the end of the discussion, he comes and says, no, the trends are that we're doing the right things, not fast enough necessarily, but we're moving in the right direction. And with more effort, we will get there. So he is that optimist. But yes, we all fall in that moment of, oh my gosh, things aren't going fast enough. I do, but it's nice to know that Michael is sort of saying, hey, it's not all doom and gloom. Morse climate scientists are talking about how we feel about these things, and the fact that yes, we're upset, yes, we're concerned, yes, we're trying to do everything we can, but we're also doing it because we care about ourselves, our families, our communities, and our planet. So we're going to continue, and we're going to work and work and work. It's our action that matters. Action gets rid of that fear, and action becomes hope. And every time, once in a while, you come across somebody like Crystal. By the way, I just noticed it's her birthday today. Happy birthday, Crystal. Crystal, a former student of mine. And I remember her thesis about plastics in the Bahamas. We did some amazing work on that. This is somebody who went out and said, there's plastics polluting the beaches of the Bahamas. I want to change that. One person developed an organization that brings in children every year to teach them during the summer about plastics and cleaning up the beaches. She gets money, she wins awards. She was given a full scholarship for a PhD. This is a person who is, for me, a hero. Like, she's my ocean warrior, as I call her. Therein is my optimism, is I see people actually doing something to make a difference every single day. And it's great. And her energy and her lively, her, the way she feels about these things, it's infectious. It's amazing, wonderful to watch. Another hero of mine is Lewis Pugh, who's an ocean ambassador for the United Nations. Lewis is the only person to have swum in the Antarctic, off the glaciers of Greenland, and he swam the English Channel, but not across. He swam the length of the English Channel. He was the first person to swim the length of it, not across it. This is a picture of him inside a glacier in Antarctica swimming. Right? Every time he does this, by the way, he nearly dies from hypothermia and from everything. It's an amazing discussion to have with him about how it works. But people are out there doing this sort of thing, raising the awareness, doing the hard work, putting their lives at risk in his case to try to raise awareness of what's going on. These heroes are there if you look for them. The pessimists are there if you look for them. I prefer to look for the heroes. I'm not going to mention about the religious aspect of this, but in 1968, the Apollo 8 crew saw Earthrise. It was Christmas Eve. And, if you think about it, Christmas Eve, 1968 wasn't a good year, by the way. Never turn down serendipity. It's hopeful. Sometimes things happen and you go, why is there's no reason, but it's serendipity. And it's like, wow, this is amazing. Christmas Eve, they see the earth like this. And this is the first time we see it like that. That's pretty cool. And it gives you a sense of, I want to do something about this. This image of the Earthrise is used probably more than any other in the environmental community and climate change community. But I like to go behind and see the stories behind it about the Apollo 8. By the way, a little trivia for you, if you think about the youth of our society, as I talked about in the beginning. During the Apollo program like this in 1968-69, the average age of people in mission control dealing with it was 26. The average age was 26. That tells me youth have the ability to do so much more than we think. We just have to have optimism and drive and a goal and something to achieve and something to strive for, like the Apollo program as an example. But I also like to look at the Apollo separately. I like to look at the Earth instead of that one picture of Earthrise. I like to see it as the Earth and the Moon together, as our combination. This is the first time the Earth and Moon were seen together, and that was Voyager in 1977. That's the way I like to look at it. Not in the particulars of the pessimism and all the science and all the studies that we have to do, but to step back once in a while and say, this is amazing. Now, what am I going to do about it? And that's where the action comes in from the beauty and the optimism, which is different than the freezing from the pessimism and the lack of hope. So that's about it for me. That's all I tried to summarize very, very quickly, and hopefully have some time for some questions or comments, or as my class might do, some yelling and screaming at me.
Thanks, James, for that great talk. Folks, if you have any question, you're welcome to use the mic or you could put it in the chat.
I can start you off, James, since
Yep.
we do a lot of different kinds of communication at Nature Nova Scotia, trying to engage people in various actions, and sometimes that's climate action. I guess, do you have any recommendations for tactics that groups like ours could be using? And I know there's probably members of our member societies in here too who might be thinking the same, to be more positive and to encourage people to act using more that sense of positivity rather than the sense of urgency, like we've got to get something done now.
We have to do something now. I mean, every action we have to do is now. But I think framing it as doing it now without the panic of having to do it now, and if we don't do it now, it's over. So framing that language, using imagery, being different and creative. The number of things I've seen over my lifetime looking at climate, which goes back to my first prof, so we're talking 1984, 1985. So that's when I first experienced with climate change discussions. But looking over that time, the discussions have always seemed to end up being very afraid, very much like, oh my gosh, we got to do this, or if we don't do this, or something terrible is going to happen, and we only have so many years. But framing it in a positive way, that we actually do have time. We're actually going in the right direction. We just have to keep going. We have to maybe increase the speed at which we're going. That we are creative human beings, that we have the ability, we've done it before. So it's framing it in a positive language. And I'm a particular fan of, like that Patagonia example, I'm a particular fan of imagery, or language used as imagery, to be able to change the perspective in that way, which changes the way we talk. So rather than going into like my classroom and people saying, oh, why are we talking about this? There's no hope. Being able to go in there and say, well, here's why there's hope, and showing the images, showing the headlines, coming up with something that's different. I know it probably doesn't answer the question completely, but I think coming up with stuff that's outside the box. I'm not suggesting going out and doing a TikTok, because that's may become passe, but being outside the box. I had a student one time come up to me and said, you know what I want to do? For sea level rise in Halifax, I want to go and put a tube down on the waterfront, and I'm going to put on scuba gear and put the water up to the level that the harbor is going to go up to. And I'm going to just sit in that tube for like the day or whatever. And people will come and say, what's that? Well, here's where the water's going to be year after year. Now that's a marvelous way of communicating the issue. That's creative, that's impactful. Changing it to that sort of a perspective helps. More graphs, more science, more numbers, no, we have enough of that. The only reason I think we use numbers and the climate science is to be able to become more accurate on the actions and interactions and effects in individual areas. Like that's the climate science part. Now we need climate communication, which is about what can I do besides recycling, besides not flying, besides whatever, what can I actually do to make a difference? And that means becoming communities and talking about it and putting it forward as a common action and a positive action.
Yeah, thanks. I feel like when I was in school, there was definitely a push to just get out more data, and the more information people have, the more likely they'll be to act. And that definitely turned out to not be the case. People make decisions based on culture and other things, emotions that are not always logical or based in science. So interesting thought.
Yeah.
Do you have any other examples of projects like that that are either currently going on or that you've heard about, keen students interested in doing that are changing the way that we communicate around climate?
Well, Crystal Ambrose, the one I showed you, is one of them. I have another student who's working through our marine affairs program, who is looking at fisheries issues, for example, and trying to talk about it in a serious but positive way of positive action. I've had a lot of students recently look at sea level rise, which we could look at disasters and destructions and sorry to say it this way, but the end of communities on the coast, which is a reality. But they put it in a positive way of you could rebuild a community and actually build your community to be what it was, stronger, connected, by doing this related to climate change. So that's one thing. Students have surprised me over and over again in their creativity and their way of looking at things. If I just let them be positive and creative. When I, like you were saying about the numbers, when I try to stick numbers and say, oh no, you have to say this, you have to say that, you have to give these, this data, this citation of a paper, it dies. It just doesn't work the more we throw that stuff at people. So sea level rise, they've done it. I've seen students doing it on things related to pollution in the ocean. I've seen them doing it on the impact of climate change on forestry, on biodiversity, and framing it in a way that is not negative, but points to positive action and talks about communities, discussing individual to individual, community to community. You can only build a community and build that community action individual to individual. You don't sit in a room and say, let's build a community. You build it conversation to conversation. And that takes time, it takes patience, it takes, if you will, politeness, I guess, respect, acceptance of differences. And as Catherine Heo said, one of the things to do with students and with everyone else is to talk to people about the common concerns they have about their future and their life and their kids and their livelihood. What's your concern? What do you need to happen? Where do you want to be in 20 years? Rather than saying, you have to do this or everything's going to end. That just makes people freeze. And luckily, I have students who have tapped into that. And they're doing some amazing, amazing things. Actually, the students is what makes me optimistic more than anything in the world.
So you're a geographer.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about the role maps play in climate communication and how that might be changing in your field to incorporate these things that we're talking about? And do you have any cool maps that we might share with our societies, our members?
Whoa. Yeah, there are a few cool ones on my website, on our GIS Center DAL website. There are some story maps. We call them story maps because they're maps and they're presented as websites and stories. So there are some out there, for sure. The maps are amazing. I used to make them on drafting boards with paper and pen, and we thought, oh, this is a great map. It explains everything, but it just didn't speak to people. Now we can make them using geographic information systems or GIS. We can make them in 3 dimensions. We can make them showing things over time. To show you that the map is not necessarily, we think, there was a movie called Zootopia. And in Zootopia, they showed this train going into this big city and all the features of the city. That was created using the same software I have in my office, the GIS software. So we can create ways of looking at the world. And that's what the map is now. It's a way of looking at the world, but in different dimensions than we used to be able to do, and faster, and with imagery as well. So for example, if I were to have anybody come into my office and I was to show them show that person an air photograph of a place, not a Google image, but just an air photograph from, say, 40 years ago, people will immediately look at that and try to find their house or their street or their school or their whatever they are looking for. And when they see it, they'll be connected to that place, psychologically connected, and say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that this is what it looked like at that point. And then they'll look at the current one and see the change over time. So the exact same thing happens with climate change. Is they'll show a map, say, for example, of sea surface temperatures over, from say 1980 to 2000. And then they'll show maps of sea surface temperatures from 2000 to 2020. And people will see in those maps, in those images, the changes. I don't have to say anything. It's like they look at it and go, oh yeah, I get it. The map, the great thing about the maps that we make and the things that we do is we don't have to say a word after we've done the work. They speak for themselves. Images are, a picture's worth 1,000 words, a map is worth 1,000,000. That's the way we talk about it as geographers. Images are powerful, powerful. The most, like, look at the image behind me, right? So that's a whale, a female whale, and her calf that was just born like a day before. I could talk to you about a whale and a calf being born, and you know, okay, whatever. But showing you that, it's like, oh my gosh, like, wow, that takes your breath away. Same thing with a map. You can show a map and it's like, now I get it. Now I see it. Showing it in 3 dimensions, even better. Showing it as a movie over time is even better. And we have the technology now, more than enough technology to do that. And in terms of climate communication and talking about climate to people, this is, the changes in our mapping are fantastic. It's like, oh, I wish I had it 30, 40 years ago. It's fantastic now. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but yes, that's what geographers do. Not all geographers, but that's what we do, is we try to communicate those things using imagery. But some of us also use calculus too, once in a while.
So we got a question here in the chat. Miso, she wants to know that grocery stores and food processor play a big part. For example, the packaging used are largely plastics. How can we convey and convince these guys to switch from plastic to paper/cardboard? Who would they listen to?
There are groups out there that are talking about doing this. I know the Ecology Action Center has been doing a lot in trying to get organizations to reduce plastics. I just showed you my former student, Ambrose. She deals with an organization which is it's called the Plastic Pollution Coalition. And if they don't have anyone locally, they'd be people that would work on this. I have students working for the World Wildlife Fund who've been dealing in this area in terms of moving things away from packaging. The other thing to do is talk to your friends, talk to people in your community and say, why don't we write a letter to like Sobeys and say, we've noticed this packaging. I've talked to the manager at my local store because I've seen plastic packaging on apples. So there've been 4 apples in a plastic packaging. And I've gone up to the manager and said, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Why don't you just leave them in a bin? Oh, because people want to see that they're pristine and precise and perfect. Like, why? Because people will only buy perfect looking material, food, right? So the packaging is a real big problem. Okay, I have no dispute. I hate the plastic packaging completely because it's overused, really overused. But I'll put it back to you. What about the issue in terms of grocery stores and food processing and food creation and distribution? What about the notion that we as consumers will only buy food that looks on the shelf all the same and perfect? Go into a store and look at I'll give you Granny Smith apples. Just pick that. And you see Granny Smith apples lined up on the shelf, all perfectly in a nice, neat rows. And they're all perfect. There's no bruises. As soon as a bruise forms on an apple, somebody comes through in the evening, usually, or at night, overnight, and takes that bruised apple and throws it out. It's gone. It's thrown out in the garbage because it's bruised. If the color and shape of an orange or a grapefruit or anything is not correct, it's thrown out. So we have a problem with packaging. Not only grocery stores, we have a problem in packaging. And like I bought something for my computer at work and it had so much plastic in it. I'm like, it's this little tiny thing. And it had plastic like enough for a couch or, even a car or whatever. And it was just a tiny little thing. But in terms of food in stores, I think the biggest issue, while packaging is vital, I won't dispute that. I think the biggest issue is food waste. 58% of our food is wasted. We never see it. We never eat it. 58% of the food never goes in our mouth. So because that's the question. I mean, packaging cereal in cardboard boxes with plastic cellophane, and yet takes up way too much for that. I mean, it'd be interesting. There are groups, I would say, again, there are groups that are going around looking at the packaging in stores, not just grocery, but all stores. We need to look at how we distribute the products that we buy in total, not just one group. So, but I salute you, and I suggest you contact those various groups, the World Wildlife Fund, the Ecology Action Center, maybe the Plastics Coalition. Contact them online and say, what can I do in my local area? So I salute you for wanting to do that in the grocery stores. I really do. From a total climate change issue, from a total sustainability issue, it's how we package everything that we consume and how we waste so much of what we don't consume.
Sounds like that grocery store would benefit from one of these demonstrations we've been talking about, like the tube of water, maybe a big pile of plastic. An idea for you, May.
That would be pretty cool. Oh, there's another one here. Why people are consuming plastic bottle? Why can't they boil water then drink? Interestingly, that's a neat one. By the way, if you have plastic bottled water in the local area, you're more likely to get sick from the bottled water than you are from the tap water, because the tap water is constantly monitored and treated so that you're not going to get anything from it. But plastic bottled water, sometimes you don't know what's happening at the factory, so often something can get in there. Plastic bottled water, convenience. That's all it is. I have a metal container for water, but there are times when I don't have my metal container, and I'll be, okay, I'm really thirsty. There's no tap. What do I do? Where do I go? And the only thing that's available to me is plastic. Maybe if we made more water fountains available. That's an interesting one. We had water fountains when I was growing up. We had water fountains around the city. There was a water fountain in the public gardens here in Halifax, but they took it out because the concern was over contamination, that somebody would stick their lips on it and you'd get sick from it. So they took it out. The city didn't want to be liable for bad water, but we used to have water fountains around, and it was like, yeah, they were there. So taking that stuff away meant plastic bottled water. The bottled water industry, by the way, is a huge nightmare in terms of land ownership, water rights access, drawdown of aquifers. I was in Mexico City one time doing a study and doing a workshop with a group from the World Bank and from the Canadian government, Mexican and American government. And we were talking about water drawdown of the aquifer in Western United States, Western Mexico, Western Canada. And the water companies were drawing down enormous amounts of water. And that was what was causing problems in terms of farming and agriculture, irrigation, so on and so forth. It's, the bottled water companies, there are some issues in there too. Everyone's so silent. I see all these things on mute and names, and it's like
quiet audience tonight.
A very quiet audience. Maybe they're watching Netflix. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's something better on.
I think it's been a busy time. A lot of us have contributed to the old forest policy call for comments, and there's been a moose plan released recently. It's been a busy month.
That's something I always wanted to talk to the government about was, it's nice that you're trying to do a lot of effort, and it's important to do it and sometimes do it quickly, but you got to give people a chance to communicate as communities, as individuals, to be able to put together ideas. We get it in the research grant area. Research grants come up and it's like, oh, you have so much time to write a research grants have to be huge. And, put it in, and it's like not the best. You put together whatever you can as quickly as possible. But I think, Pablo Picasso said, great things come from great moments of contemplation. And I think in terms of the environment, we need to be able to have time to do this. And there is time. So I'll have to mention that to some friends I have in government to say, stop rushing these things, give people a chance to get together and talk. Because the government has all their people working on it, and the private sector have all their people working on it. But we have a harder time because we're not in a company, we're not in a government department. We're communities of people, and we need time.
Yeah, this is really great. You know, as a nature lover, listening to the media and stuff, gave me a lot of anxiety about the climate crisis. But it's nice to know that we have the technology and stuff to like solve this climate crisis. It's just the thing that, I guess we do not know how to talk about it. So it's time to start using our language. In the right way to be able to determine how to deal with this and involve in the community, talking to our families and friends about, like, for example, who to vote for, and put in power to, to help, create solution for this, and also like being aware of the propaganda out there, and contributing a lot to outreach. Like, I work personally before with protected areas. I'm really I really like trying to protect any ecosystem out there, because I think that also help with that. So from this talk and taking your class, it got me really optimistic about the climate change, and I know that there's hope out there.
There is, and I'm glad you got that from class too, because that was my hope. Was it at the end you would get that hope?
So, folks, we have given you a couple things that you could do, but it would be nice to know what we could do for you as well. I want to thank everyone who tuned in tonight. We can leave there for now, folks. But if you have any more questions, we will definitely make sure you get James' email.
Sure.
Also, you can sign up for our email list if you have not already, or follow us on social media to get notified of more events. Becky, am I missing anything?
Well, I mean, definitely join us next month, folks. So first Tuesday of next month, which is, I think, really early in January. This one was a little bit later. Mm-hmm. Unity, do we know what we're talking about next month, or do we still have to figure that topic out? I can't remember now.
Yeah, we're looking at some bird friendly topics to make a bird friendly city.
All right, bird stuff. All right, so we'll probably be talking about bird stuff next month, so definitely tune in for that. We heard from folks that despite the silence we got tonight, we did hear from folks saying they wanted the opportunity to ask questions in person. Typing questions into YouTube, I guess, doesn't appeal to everyone, so the talks will still go up on YouTube. So if you miss a talk, you can always go there and watch one. But we'll stick to Zoom for now, so you can tune in this way. So yeah, we'll send out a link for the next one in the next couple weeks and send you an alert so you get notified and reminded. There's some other stuff going on at Nature Nova Scotia that you might be interested in. So we are releasing the State of Nature report this month, actually hopefully by the end of this week if I can get my ducks in a row. And so that's going to review a lot of things that happened in the province over the last year, and a year and a bit actually. So if you're not a current member or supporter, you can still get a copy of that report. You just have to sign up for a digital copy. And if you are a current member or supporter, you'll get it anyway. So watch for that. I think tomorrow morning we have that form going live. So if you do want to sign up for a copy of the report, just head over to our Facebook or Twitter. You can sign up really easy there. That report's going to outline a couple different actions we're asking people to take into 2022. We're going to be distributing some Save the Mainland Moose lawn signs, which we're really excited about. So there'll be information about that in the report. We're also going to be asking people to put pressure on the government to get ecological forestry moving. I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience why we're frustrated at the delays. So there'll be information there about that. yeah, and just some other interesting stuff about things that have happened over the last year. So yeah, check that out. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, James, for being with us tonight. And I also want to thank everyone for watching and listening. Folks, we will let you go for the night. So have a good night, and we will see you at the next talk.
Thank you, Unity and Becky. It was a huge pleasure and privilege, and I can only wish you humongous success in what you're doing, which is vitally important to Nova Scotia, but as an example to other places too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night. Bye. Thanks.
Good night. Thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel. If you're not already, please give this video a like if you like our Nature Talk series. Thank you. See you in the next video. Bye.